We've been going through the book of Romans, the first half of the book of Romans as we headed into Easter, talking about some of the basics of the gospel. Now let me remind you what it says back in Romans 1:16, which we started out with here some weeks ago. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek." The gospel is the power of God that brings salvation for everyone who believes. And we've seen here in these opening chapters what that good news of the gospel is, and to some degree the extent of that gospel. That even though we're all sinners facing the wrath of God, Jesus died for us. He took God's wrath on himself. And as he was raised from the dead, as we talked about and celebrated last Sunday, he raises us up to live in a newness of life, not only forgiving us, but changing our hearts and our lives. But there's even more good news as you go on from here in the book of Romans, and that has to do with the extent to which God saves us and makes us new. And the second half of the book of Romans deals more with that truth. Now, how much does being saved really change us? To what degree can we really be godly people and live holy lives? How far can that newness of life we talked about, how far can that take us in our walk with God? How much deliverance from sin can we actually experience while we're still on this earth, living in these physical bodies and facing all the temptations and evils and pressures from the world around us? There's a passage over in Romans 7 that doesn't paint a very hopeful picture about all of that. Paul writes there in that 7th chapter, beginning at verse 14. He says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me." I hope you're able to follow that there, the way it was worded. There's a lot of debate on the particular perspective Paul is describing here. Whether he's describing his current situation at that time as a believer, or if he was referring to something in the past, like his situation when he was trying to be good enough to be saved through obeying God's laws, or maybe some other situation. And some point to this as being the normal experience for a believer, the best we can hope for in this life in regards to salvation. That we're going to have this divided heart that's described here, and always struggle mightily over doing what's right. Now, we may want to do the right thing, but we usually end up, as it's described here, giving in and doing the wrong thing instead. Some see that as the norm for a born-again follower of Jesus. Yet, as we saw there in chapter 1, Paul spoke about the gospel as being the power of God to salvation. And there really doesn't seem to be much power in this situation we read about here, does it? It comes across that we're weak and helpless to do what God wants us to do, and that sin still has a giant hold on us. And within us is this constant battle, this civil war going on, this conflict of a divided heart, where part of us is wanting to follow the Lord, and part of us insisting on having our own way and doing what we know we shouldn't. And that doesn't sound very peaceful or pleasant, does it? Well, I don't believe this is describing the normal Christian life. Why? Because if you go on from this passage, it seems to paint a different picture. It shows that something else should be the norm. For one thing, you get down to verse 24 of this chapter, and it says, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord." Paul's saying that his condition he described here is awful. He refers to himself as wretched, and he's crying out for deliverance from it. But then he answers, "I thank God there is deliverance from it." We can be set free from that divided heart. Deliverance comes through Jesus. And then as you go on from there into chapter 8, it talks about how someone who is walking in the flesh, following their own selfish and what we might say this worldly desires and practices, how someone walking in the flesh cannot please God and truly follow Him. It contrasts walking according to the flesh and walking according to the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit. If we're truly saved and walking in newness of life, then we're going to live more like God wants us to live. We're going to live following the leading of the Holy Spirit, living the way the Spirit who lives in us leads us to live and enables us to live. Paul said back in chapter 7, when he was describing that struggle, that divided heart, he said there in verse 14, "I am carnal." Now, carnal means of the flesh, and it stands in contrast to being spiritual. Especially here in chapter 8, and when you get into verses 6 through 8 of this 8th chapter, he says, "Therefore, to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. So then those who are in the flesh cannot please God." The normal Christian life isn't for us to remain carnal and to be giving in to self and sin all the time. We should, through the Holy Spirit working in us, progress past that and be walking or living more in harmony with the Holy Spirit. We can be saved to the extent that we no longer have such a divided heart, constantly battling over whether to follow God or to do what I want to do. But we can have a surrendered heart, surrendered to God and to His will, and walking in the Spirit as it talks about here, and more constantly doing what He wants us to do. Now, it's not that we won't ever struggle or stumble, but we're committed to following Jesus. We've surrendered our will to His will. And so when the temptations or other issues arise, in a sense, the decision's already been made. We're going God's way, whatever that may be. I'm reading a daily devotional book this year written by E. Stanley Jones, a well-known missionary and evangelist from the early and middle part of the last century. And the section that I'm reading right now is dealing with this very issue that we're talking about. So I'll be referring to several things that he says about it. But he calls the idea of self-surrender, giving ourselves completely to the Lord or dying to self, he calls that the crux of our problem, that it's the main sticking point and that which we as believers need to deal with. But he raises the point that someone might ask, but didn't I do that at conversion? When we were saved, when we put our faith in Jesus for salvation, didn't we give ourselves to Him then? Jones's response is, yes, you did in measure, but not wholly, W-H-O-L-L-Y, not completely. He says, now you see deeper depths that must be surrendered. And I think that tends to be true, that after we put our trust in Jesus to forgive us and give us eternal life, as we move forward, we often find that we do still struggle over certain issues. We do find ourselves kind of like Paul described there in chapter 7, that we want to please the Lord now. We're saved, we want to please the Lord, but we find it hard to do. Our desires keep getting in the way, and we struggle over doing what God wants, and we really want to do what God wants us to do, but we struggle with doing that or doing what I want. We falter way too often, and it can get discouraging and frustrating. We discover that even though we're saved, there's a lot of ourselves getting in the way, and we come to realize our need for a more complete or fuller surrender to the Lord's will, which is something we may not have seen as clearly before we received Christ, because at that point we were more concerned with our past sins and being forgiven and making peace with a holy God. But after we got saved, we saw this other need more clearly. We've got to get self out of the way so that we can live more fully for the Lord. E. Stanley Jones puts it this way. He said, the difference between a quack and a real doctor is this. A quack doctor treats symptoms. A real doctor treats diseases. Christ now asks that we allow him not merely to treat individual sins, the symptoms of a deeper malady, but the very root, the self. That self must be crucified. And that's true. After we're saved, we realize there's still a disease of sorts in us. We're forgiven, we're assured of heaven, we love Jesus, but self-will, that sin nature, is still getting in the way. And self is the hardest thing for us to let go of. We want to hang on to control. We want to have Jesus in our lives, but not really let him have the final word in things. Now, Jones compared it to something he had witnessed the Chinese doing back in his day and time. He said, some Chinese offer to their gods what to them is one of the most precious things they have, the pig. It used to be that the whole animal was offered, but he says now they offer the severed head with the severed tail in its mouth and keep the body for themselves. And of course, that's where all the good meat is, isn't it? He says, with us, there's a good deal of offering of that kind. And he calls us in that way halfway givers. That's the term he uses, halfway givers. He suggests we offer the useless remnants and keep the self intact. We offer our service and withhold the self. We offer our talents occasionally to Christ, but reserve to ourselves the right to decide the really big things of our lives. He talks about how we may make a resolution to completely surrender to the Lord, but then we add on these little exceptions, well, not this and not that, and it ends up nullifying the whole thing. It's hard to let go and truly say, Lord, whatever, whatever you want, whatever you say, I'll do it. Your will, not mine, be done. Think about that part of the Lord's Prayer. It says, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Are we willing to pray that for our own lives? To say, your will be done in me. Your will be done in my life. Your will be done in my heart, my mind, my thoughts, my affections, just as perfectly and completely as your will is done in heaven. This idea of an offering takes me over to Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Romans 12:1. This is really a key verse for the second half of Romans and what it's teaching in this part of the book. But you get to 12:1 and it says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. We are to give ourselves completely to the Lord. We're to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. Now, this alludes to the animal sacrifices that the Jews were, of course, very familiar with, especially the burnt offering, in which the whole animal was given over to the Lord and burned on the altar, that we're to give ourselves in such a full and complete way to God. Of course, we don't literally put ourselves on an altar like Abraham bound his son Isaac and placed him on an altar when God told him to sacrifice his son in order to test Abraham's faith and his trust in him. And even though Abraham was willing to do it and was about to do it, remember God stopped him and provided an animal for the sacrifice instead. Well, God isn't asking us to literally sacrifice ourselves on an altar, but as it says there, to be living sacrifices, to give ourselves completely to Him, to surrender to Him and to His will to the extent that it's like we're dead to our own desires and plans and will. So in that sense, we die to ourselves. We give ourselves to the Lord and to doing whatever He says, submitting to Him. We're still alive, but we're living completely for Jesus, living and acting in accord to whatever He says and whatever He wants us to do. We get ourselves out of the way so that we can more fully submit to the Lord and to His will. And it is a complete sacrifice. We can't hold anything back. E. Stanley Jones says that we'll be tempted to do what the Hindu does when offering a water buffalo to their god. He says, the long knife falls toward the neck of the buffalo, but just as it's about to strike, the executioner skillfully turns it and cuts off the tip of its ear instead. And at that point, the sacrifice is finished and everyone is satisfied. And that's what we're tempted to do when we encounter this verse and seek to give ourselves as living sacrifices. We're tempted to just cut off the tip of some self-indulgence in our life, or we cut off this sin or that sin, but we leave the self untouched. We still don't strike that big blow of saying, Lord, I give myself totally to you. Cleanse me of all selfishness and self-will. From now on, it's not my will, but your will be done. There's an old song that says, I'm yours, Lord. Everything I am, everything I've got, everything I'm not. And we need to experience that kind of complete surrender to the Lord, because that is what will enable us to live the kind of life that it depicts in this second half of Romans. A life of walking in the Spirit rather than walking in the flesh. A life of victory over sin and self. Now, I thought I might actually come back next Sunday and preach one more message here from Romans, but I believe the main point I was going to focus on in that message can be made right here, and it's related to what we're talking about. And that's that the second half of Romans pictures a believer who is living in victory over sin, not one who is in bondage to sin. It pictures a Spirit-filled follower of Jesus who is staying true to God and is living a godly life in spite of all that a sinful and hostile world may throw at him or her. Remember what it says back in Romans chapter 8, verses 35 through 39. It says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are killed all day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. So you see it there. We are more than conquerors through Christ. No matter what difficulties we face, no matter how tough our circumstances or how strong the opposition to us, we can overcome through Christ. And that brings me to one more verse. Back in that 12th chapter, the last verse of that chapter. After it talks in this 12th chapter about how we ought to live and the spirit we can have and how we can serve the Lord, it ends by saying there in verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We're not to be overcome by evil, either evil from the world around us or not by the evil from our sin nature and self within us. We're not to be overcome by evil, but we're to overcome evil with good. And through Christ, we can do that. We can be conquerors. We can be overcomers through Jesus. But I believe the only way we're going to experience that to the extent that it's pictured here is if we do totally surrender ourselves to Christ, put our self or self-will and self-centeredness to death, and let Jesus fill us with His Spirit, and let it be not just me living, but Jesus living in me and through me. That constant battle in our hearts between God's will and my will isn't the way it ought to be. We've got to put self on the cross and submit to Jesus as Lord, King, ruler, the boss, however you want to put it. We've got to surrender to Him and be willing to do whatever He says from now on. And like I said, self will try to get in the way at times. And we may have to daily affirm that Jesus is still the one on the throne of our lives. But we can so give ourselves to Him that we're not constantly fighting that inner civil war between my will and His will. We can have greater victory over sin in our lives. We can walk more in the Spirit rather than in the flesh. We can be more than conquerors through Christ. We can be more faithful and more consistent in our walk with God. We can serve Him better and more faithfully. But so much of that rests on whether or not we presented ourselves as a living sacrifice to Him. Don't just cut off the ear of the water buffalo, but as best you know how, put your all on the altar and say, Lord, I'm yours, completely yours. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, no exceptions, nothing holding back. Whatever you say, whatever your will is, I'm willing to do it. Let's quit being halfway givers and let's yield ourselves completely to the Lord this morning.